Sarah Thompson sat at her kitchen table one spring morning, surrounded by wedding magazines and her laptop, while her fiancé Michael Chen prepared breakfast. The couple had decided to host their wedding in their own backyard, a decision that made perfect sense given their beautiful Victorian home with its sprawling garden in the suburbs of Boston. Sarah, a respected federal judge known for her fair rulings and sharp intellect, had always preferred intimate gatherings to grand celebrations. Michael, who had built his reputation as one of the city's finest cardiac surgeons, shared her sentiment. They had been together for 5 years, their paths crossing in the most unexpected way when Sarah needed emergency surgery after a car accident, and Michael was the surgeon on call. Their wedding planning started 3 months before the big day. The couple wanted everything to be perfect but understated. Their spacious backyard, with its century-old oak trees and well-maintained flower beds, would provide the perfect setting for their ceremony. They planned to host only 50 guests, their closest friends, family members, and respected colleagues from both the legal and medical communities. One Tuesday morning, while reviewing their guest list, Sarah noticed their next-door neighbor, Karen Wilson, peering through her window at them. Karen had moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago and had already earned a reputation for being difficult. She had complained about everything from children playing too loudly to leaves falling from trees onto her property. "Maybe we should give Karen a heads up about the wedding," Michael suggested, noticing Sarah's concerned expression. "It's the neighborly thing to do." Sarah nodded, though she felt a knot forming in her stomach. She had noticed how Karen would often cross the street when she saw Michael coming, or how she would abruptly end her gardening when Sarah stepped outside. Still, Sarah believed in giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. The couple spent the next few weeks coordinating with vendors. They'd hired a local catering company known for their excellent Mediterranean cuisine, arranged for elegant white chairs and tables to be delivered, and ordered a small but beautiful wedding cake from a family-owned bakery. Their permit applications for the event were filed properly with the city council, and they even distributed notices to all neighbors within a 2-block radius about the upcoming celebration. When Sarah and Michael approached Karen's house to personally invite her to the wedding, they were met with a cold reception. Karen barely opened her door, keeping the security chain in place. "A wedding? Here?" Karen's voice was sharp. "This is a quiet neighborhood. We don't do those kinds of things here." "It's going to be a small gathering," Sarah explained patiently. "Just 50 people, and we'll wrap up by 9 p.m. Karen's eyes narrowed as she looked between Sarah and Michael. "We'll see about that," she muttered before closing the door. Despite Karen's reaction, the couple continued with their preparations. Their backyard was transformed day by day. String lights were hung between the trees, creating a magical canopy. A small wooden arch was built for the ceremony, which would later be decorated with fresh flowers. They set up a tent area for dining and dancing, ensuring it was positioned far from any neighbor's property line. The week before the wedding, Sarah noticed increased activity at Karen's house. She seemed to be constantly on her phone, taking pictures of their property and making notes. Several times, Karen called the city council to complain about potential noise violations, but each time, she was informed that the couple had obtained all necessary permits. Michael tried to maintain his optimism. "Don't let her get to you," he told Sarah one evening as they sat on their back porch, reviewing final details. "Our wedding will be perfect because we'll be surrounded by people who love and support us." Sarah squeezed his hand, grateful for his unwavering positivity. As a federal judge, she had dealt with all kinds of people and situations, but something about Karen's behavior made her uneasy. Still, she refused to let one prejudiced neighbor cast a shadow over their special day. The night before the wedding, as they finished the final preparations, they noticed Karen's silhouette in her window, watching them intently. Neither Sarah nor Michael could have predicted just how far their neighbor would go to disrupt their celebration, or how spectacularly her plans would backfire. To be continued in Part 2. The weeks leading up to Sarah and Michael's wedding brought increasing tension to their peaceful suburban neighborhood. Karen Wilson, the troubled neighbor, had made it her personal mission to create as many obstacles as possible for the couple's upcoming celebration. It started with the 8:00 meetings. Karen attended every single one, armed with a thick folder of complaints about Sarah and Michael's property. She questioned everything from the height of their grass to the color of their mailbox, issues that had never been problems before. "Those people are bringing down our property values," Karen announced during one meeting, her voice thick with prejudice. The other neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah, who typically attended these meetings but was absent due to work, was represented by Michael that evening. If you have specific concerns about our property, Karen, you're welcome to discuss them with us directly. Michael responded calmly, his years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room serving him well. Karen's campaign didn't stop there. She began documenting every car that parked on their street, claiming they were suspicious vehicles. In reality, they were just Sarah's fellow judges or Michael's medical colleagues stopping by to help with wedding preparations. One afternoon, while Sarah was reviewing case files on her porch, she overheard Karen on the phone. "Yes, they're planning some kind of gathering," Karen was saying loudly, clearly wanting to be heard. "Who knows what kind of people they'll bring into our neighborhood? Something needs to be done." Michael noticed how these incidents were affecting Sarah. Despite her composed exterior, the same one she maintained in her courtroom, you could see the worry in her eyes. One evening, he found her staring at their wedding plans with unusual intensity. "Maybe we should consider a different venue," Sarah suggested quietly. "The country club is still available." Michael sat beside her, taking her hands in his. "This is our home, Sarah. We shouldn't have to change our plans because of one person's prejudice." The situation escalated when Karen started calling the police for trivial matters. First, it was about the delivery trucks bringing wedding supplies. Then she complained about the landscaping crew working on their garden. Each time, the police came, checked the situation, and left after finding nothing wrong. During one such visit, Officer Rodriguez, who had responded to several of Karen's calls, pulled Sarah aside. "Judge Thompson," he said respectfully, "we understand what's happening here. We're documenting all these false reports." Sarah thanked him but declined to file any complaints against Karen. As a judge, she understood the importance of maintaining professional dignity, even in the face of blatant discrimination. The weekend before the wedding, Karen orchestrated her most dramatic attempt to disrupt their plans. She organized an emergency AVOA meeting, claiming she had evidence of zoning violations related to the upcoming wedding. The meeting, held in the community center, drew a larger crowd than usual. Karen stood at the podium, projecting photos of Sarah and Michael's property onto a screen. "Look at these violations," she declared, pointing to pictures of perfectly normal wedding preparations. What Karen hadn't expected was the presence of James Martinez, a real estate attorney who lived 3 doors down. He calmly stood up and addressed the room. "I've reviewed all the permits and preparations for this wedding. Everything is completely within code and properly authorized." The meeting ended with Karen storming out, her face red with anger and embarrassment. But the incident had an unexpected effect on the community. Neighbors who had previously stayed silent began stopping by Sarah and Michael's house, offering help with the wedding preparations and expressing their support. As the wedding day approached, Sarah and Michael remained focused on their celebration, trying to rise above the drama. However, they couldn't shake the feeling that Karen had something else planned. They noticed her taking photos of their property at odd hours and making numerous phone calls while watching their house. "Whatever she's planning," Sarah told Michael as they finalized the seating arrangements, "we won't let it ruin our day." Little did they know that Karen's final act of prejudice would lead to a conclusion neither she nor anyone else could have anticipated. To be continued in Part 3. The morning of Sarah and Michael's wedding arrived with perfect weather. Sunny skies and a gentle breeze that made the string lights dance between the oak trees. The couple had spent the previous night in separate houses, following tradition despite their modern outlook. Sarah got ready in their master bedroom, surrounded by her closest friends and her mother. Her wedding dress, an elegant ivory gown with subtle lace details, hung by the window. Through the glass, she could see Karen already positioned at her usual spot, smartphone in hand, documenting every delivery truck and guest arrival. "Don't even look that way," Sarah's best friend and fellow judge, Maria, said as she helped with Sarah's makeup. "Today is about you and Michael, not about her." Maria had known Sarah since law school and had watched her relationship with Michael blossom from the very beginning. Meanwhile, Michael was getting ready at his brother's house 2 streets over. As he adjusted his bow tie, he received updates from the wedding coordinator about the final preparations. Everything was running smoothly. The catering team had arrived on time, the flowers were perfectly arranged, and the musicians were setting up their equipment. By noon, The backyard had transformed into an enchanting wedding venue. White chairs were arranged in neat rows facing the flower-adorned arch. The reception area under the tent looked magnificent, with tables decorated with centerpieces of white roses and green foliage. The three-tier wedding cake, adorned with fresh flowers, stood proudly on its display. The first guests began arriving at 2 p.m. Among them were several distinguished judges, including the Chief Justice of the state's Supreme Court, who had mentored Sarah early in her career. Medical professionals from the city's top hospitals, many of whom had worked alongside Michael in countless surgeries, arrived shortly after. Karen's surveillance intensified as more guests arrived. She paced along her property line, taking videos of the guests parking their luxury vehicles along the street. Her face grew increasingly red as she watched town cars drop off well-dressed visitors, many of whom she recognized from television and newspapers. At 2:30 p.m., a particularly notable group arrived, the entire surgical team from Michael's hospital, led by Dr. James Wilson, no relation to Karen, the chief of surgery. They were followed by 3 state senators who had worked with Sarah on various legal reform committees. The guests mingled in the backyard, creating a powerful assembly of legal minds and medical expertise. Conversations flowed between Supreme Court decisions and groundbreaking medical procedures. The atmosphere was exactly what Sarah and Michael had hoped for: intimate yet distinguished, casual yet elegant. From her window, Karen watched in growing agitation as more prominent members of society arrived. She had clearly underestimated the social standing of her neighbors. Her phone was practically glued to her ear as she made call after call, though none of her usual complaints seemed to be getting the response she wanted. At 2:45 p.m., just 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, Michael arrived. He looked handsome in his tailored black tuxedo, greeting guests with warm smiles and firm handshakes. His parents, who had flown in from San Francisco, beamed with pride as they watched their son prepare to marry the woman he loved. Sarah remained upstairs, taking final moments to prepare. Her father, a retired civil rights attorney, waited outside her door, ready to walk her down the aisle. Through the window, she could see their garden filled with friends and family, all gathered to celebrate their love. What nobody noticed was Karen slipping into her house, her face set with determination. She had made one final call, one that she believed would surely disrupt this gathering she found so offensive. As she waited by her window, a satisfied smirk spread across her face when she heard the distant sound of sirens. The guests, absorbed in conversation and celebration, were unaware of the approaching police cars. The string quartet had just begun playing the prelude music, and the officiant had taken his place under the arch. Everything was perfect, until the unmistakable sound of police sirens grew louder and louder. To be continued in Part 4. The peaceful afternoon air was suddenly pierced by the wailing of police sirens. 3 police cars pulled up in front of Sarah and Michael's house, their lights flashing against the elegant wedding decorations. The string quartet stopped mid-song, and a hush fell over the gathered guests. Officer David Martinez stepped out of the lead car, followed by his partners from the other vehicles. They had received an urgent call about a suspicious gathering with claims of potential drug activity and unauthorized weapons. As they approached the property, however, the scene before them was anything but suspicious. From her window, Karen watched with gleaming eyes as the police made their way through the front gate. She had crafted her complaint carefully, using specific phrases she thought would trigger an immediate response. Her satisfaction, however, would be short-lived. Michael, ever composed, stepped forward to meet the officers. Behind him, several guests exchanged knowing looks. Among them were the police commissioner and 2 senior FBI agents who had worked extensively with Sarah on federal cases. "Officers, how can I help you?" Michael asked calmly, his surgical precision evident in his measured tone. "We're in the middle of my wedding ceremony." Officer Martinez looked increasingly uncomfortable as he scanned the crowd. He recognized numerous faces from the justice system, including judges he regularly appeared before in court. The suspicious gathering, Karen had reported, was clearly a sophisticated wedding celebration attended by some of the city's most respected citizens. "Sir, we received a report about..." Officer Martinez began, but his voice trailed off as he spotted Chief Justice Eleanor Martinez, no relation, sitting in the front row. The Chief Justice gave him a subtle nod of recognition. At this moment, Sarah appeared at the back door, still in her wedding dress, her father by her side. The sight of police cars had interrupted her entrance, but her judicial composure remained intact. Several officers immediately recognized her. She had presided over numerous police testimony cases and was known for her fair treatment of law enforcement. Judge Thompson, Officer Martinez said, now visibly embarrassed. We had no idea this was your wedding. Karen, still watching from her window, began to realize her plan was unraveling. She had assumed the police would disrupt the wedding and possibly even make arrests. Instead, she watched in horror as the officers removed their caps in respect. The situation took an even more interesting turn when Dr. Wilson, the chief of surgery, approached the officers. "Gentlemen," he said with a knowing smile, "I believe I know the source of this complaint. Perhaps we should discuss this matter with your supervisor, who, coincidentally, is sitting right over there." He gestured toward Police Commissioner Anderson, who was already making his way over. The other guests, rather than being alarmed by the police presence, seemed almost amused. Several high-ranking legal officials were already pulling out their phones, documenting what would surely become an infamous example of false reporting. Officer Martinez turned to his colleagues and spoke quietly into his radio. "Dispatch, this is a false alarm. The reported suspicious gathering is actually Judge Thompson's wedding. Yes, Federal Judge Thompson." The silence that followed was broken by Commissioner Anderson's authoritative voice. "Officers, I believe we've all been victims of a false report. Please ensure this incident is properly documented. We'll deal with the source appropriately." From her vantage point, Karen watched as her carefully planned disruption transformed into a scene that would ultimately lead to her own undoing. The police officers were now apologizing to the couple, with Officer Martinez even offering his congratulations. Sarah, showing the grace that had earned her respect in the courtroom, addressed the officers. "Thank you for your quick response to a potential threat. We appreciate your service. Please, feel free to enjoy some wedding cake before you leave." The tension dissolved as quickly as it had built. The string quartet resumed playing, and the guests returned to their conversations, now with an unexpected story to share. The police cars quietly departed, their lights off, but not before noting down all the details of Karen's false report. As the ceremony preparations resumed, Karen remained at her window, unaware that her actions that day would have consequences far beyond her imagination. The next phase of this event would prove even more surprising than the police arrival. To be continued in Part 5. The aftermath of the police arrival created an unexpected intermission in Sarah and Michael's wedding ceremony. As the guests settled back into their seats, the incident had sparked quiet conversations throughout the gathering. What happened next would become a story retold in legal and medical circles for years to come. Officer Martinez remained behind after his colleagues left, feeling obligated to formally explain the situation to the couple. As he approached Sarah, several of her fellow judges watched with interest. The young officer found himself surrounded by more legal authority than he typically encountered in a month of courtroom appearances. "Judge Thompson," Officer Martinez began, his voice professionally controlled but clearly apologetic, "I need to inform you about the nature of the complaint we received." He glanced meaningfully toward Karen's house. The caller reported suspicious activities, possible drug dealing, and claimed there were unauthorized weapons on the premises. Sarah's expression remained neutral, the same calm demeanor she was known for in her courtroom. However, Police Commissioner Anderson, who had joined the conversation, was less reserved. "Martinez, I want a full report on my desk tomorrow morning. This kind of false reporting cannot go unchallenged." The situation took an unexpected turn when Dr. Patricia Chen, Michael's colleague and the head of emergency medicine, stepped forward. "Officer, that woman," she pointed toward Karen's house, "has been harassing my colleagues for months. Just last week, she called security on me when I was dropping off some paperwork for Michael, claiming I was casing the neighborhood." More guests began sharing similar stories. Justice Maria Rodriguez recalled how Karen had called parking enforcement when she visited Sarah for their weekly dinner. FBI agent Thompson, no relation to Sarah, mentioned receiving reports about Karen's pattern of making racially motivated complaints in other neighborhoods. Karen, still watching from her window, began to realize the gravity of her situation. Through her binoculars, she could now clearly see the various badges, credentials, and official vehicles belonging to the wedding guests. Her face paled as she recognized several faces from local news coverage. Faces of people she had just falsely reported as suspicious criminals. The wedding coordinator, sensing the need to move forward, gently suggested returning to the ceremony. However, before they could proceed, Karen made her final, fatal mistake. Believing she could somehow justify her actions, she emerged from her house and marched toward the gathering. "I was just trying to protect our neighborhood," Karen announced loudly, walking onto Sarah and Michael's property uninvited. "You can't blame me for being cautious about large gatherings of. She stopped mid-sentence as she found herself face to face with not only Sarah and Michael but also Chief Justice Eleanor Martinez, Police Commissioner Anderson, and several other distinguished guests. The reality of her situation finally seemed to dawn on her. "Mrs. Wilson," Commissioner Anderson said firmly, "I suggest you return to your home immediately. We'll be in touch regarding your false police report and potential charges for harassment." Justice Rodriguez added calmly, "And I believe the FBI might be interested in reviewing your pattern of potentially discriminatory complaints. Agent Thompson, would you agree?" Karen's face turned from red to white as she looked around at the assembled group. Here were the very people she had just accused of criminal activity: federal judges, surgeons, law enforcement officials, and other prominent community leaders. Her prejudices had led her not just to embarrassment, but potentially serious legal consequences. As Karen retreated to her house, the wedding guests returned to their seats with a new sense of unity. The incident, while unpleasant, had demonstrated the strong community supporting Sarah and Michael. The string quartet began playing again, and the ceremony was ready to proceed properly. Sarah squeezed Michael's hand as they prepared to finally begin their wedding ceremony. "Well," she whispered with a slight smile, "this will certainly be a memorable day." Michael returned her smile, adding quietly, though probably not quite the way Karen intended. The gathered guests, now even more invested in the celebration, watched as the couple prepared to exchange their vows. Meanwhile, Karen's silhouette could be seen pacing behind her curtains, undoubtedly realizing that her actions would have consequences she never anticipated. To be continued in Part 6. As the wedding ceremony was about to resume, Karen's actions had one final, desperate act left to play out. Unable to accept her humiliation quietly, she burst out of her house again, this time waving a folder full of papers and marching directly toward the gathering. "I have proof," she shouted, her voice shrill with desperation. "I've documented everything. All the suspicious activities, the constant visitors, the late-night meetings." She waved her folder of evidence in the air, her hands shaking with emotion. The wedding guests turned to watch this unexpected interruption. Among them, FBI agent Thompson discreetly spoke into his radio, while several police officers who had remained on standby moved closer to the scene. Sarah and Michael stood calmly by the flower arch as Karen approached. Behind them, their guests, an impressive collection of legal and medical professionals, watched with a mixture of disbelief and professional interest. "Mrs. Wilson," Michael began diplomatically, "this is our wedding day. Please?" "Wedding?" Karen scoffed, opening her folder. "Let me tell everyone what's really been happening in this neighborhood since you people moved in." She pulled out photographs. Pictures of Sarah meeting with other judges, Michael conferring with medical colleagues, their friends visiting for dinner parties. Chief Justice Martinez stood up from her front row seat. "Mrs. Wilson, are you aware that photographing federal judges without authorization can be considered a serious security concern?" Karen faltered for a moment but pressed on. "But look at all these people coming and going. The suspicious packages." She held up a photo of medical supplies being delivered to Michael's home office. Dr. James Wilson, the chief of surgery, stepped forward. "Those suspicious packages are medical supplies for our hospital's free clinic program. Dr. Chen coordinates it from his home office." "And those late-night meetings you documented," added Justice Rodriguez, "were federal court preparation sessions. We often work late hours on sensitive cases." Karen's face began to lose its color as more guests stood up, each one introducing themselves and explaining their professional connections to the couple. Police Commissioner Anderson approached her slowly. "Mrs. Wilson, we documented multiple false reports from you, including today's call. You've wasted police resources, harassed federal officials, and demonstrated a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior." Officer Martinez, who had remained on scene, added, "We have body camera footage of all our responses to your false calls, ma'am." Karen's demeanor suddenly shifted from aggressive to fearful as she realized she was surrounded by some of the most powerful legal and medical professionals in the state. Her folder of evidence had just become evidence against her. I was just trying to protect our property values," she stammered, her voice losing its earlier confidence. "By harassing a federal judge and a prominent surgeon?" asked Agent Thompson, who had joined the group. "That's an interesting strategy for maintaining property values." Sarah finally spoke, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used in her courtroom. "Mrs. Wilson, your actions today have crossed several legal boundaries. However, we're celebrating our wedding, and I prefer not to press charges if you agree to cease your harassment immediately." Michael added kindly, "We've always been willing to be good neighbors, Karen. That offer still stands, but this behavior has to stop." Karen stood frozen, clutching her now useless folder. The reality of her situation had finally hit home. She was facing potential legal consequences for harassment, false reporting, and interfering with federal officials, all because she couldn't accept an interracial couple in her neighborhood. I should go," she muttered, backing away from the gathering. The guests watched as she retreated to her house, this time without the smugness she had shown earlier. As Karen disappeared inside her home, Commissioner Anderson turned to the couple. "We'll handle the formal complaints through proper channels after your celebration. For now, I believe you have a wedding to complete." The guests returned to their seats, and the string quartet prepared to play again. Sarah and Michael took their places under the arch, ready to finally exchange their vows. The confrontation had ended, but its repercussions would continue long after the wedding day. To be continued in Part 7. In the days following Sarah and Michael's wedding, the story of Karen's failed attempt to disrupt their celebration spread quickly through legal and medical circles. What began as a neighbor's prejudiced actions had evolved into a cautionary tale about the consequences of discrimination. The Monday after the wedding, Karen received her first official notification. The police department delivered a formal summons regarding her false report and misuse of emergency services. Officer Martinez, who had witnessed the entire wedding incident, personally handled the delivery. "Mrs. Wilson," he said professionally, handing her the documents, "these require your immediate attention. The department is pursuing charges for multiple false reports and misuse of emergency services." Karen's hands trembled as she accepted the papers. Through her window, she could see Sarah leaving for work, wearing her judge's robes as she headed to the federal courthouse. The sight that once triggered her prejudiced complaints now filled her with dread. By Wednesday, more consequences arrived. The FBI began an investigation into her pattern of harassment against federal officials, particularly her unauthorized surveillance of Judge Thompson and other court officials. Agent Thompson led the investigation, methodically reviewing every complaint Karen had filed over the past 6 months. The local news caught wind of the story. While they maintained Sarah and Michael's privacy, headlines read, "Local resident faces charges after false police report at federal judge's wedding," and hospital board member targeted in discriminatory harassment case. Karen's reputation in the community crumbled rapidly. Neighbors who had previously remained neutral now openly avoided her. That EHOA board, where she had once voiced her complaints so confidently, sent her a formal warning about violating community harassment policies. Dr. Patricia Chen, who had experienced Karen's discrimination firsthand, organized a community meeting about inclusion and diversity. The event was held at the local community center, drawing hundreds of residents. Karen watched from her window as her neighbors attended en masse. "The issue isn't just about one incident," Dr. Chen explained to the gathered crowd. "It's about creating a community where everyone feels safe and welcome, regardless of their background." The legal consequences continued to mount. Karen's attorney, struggling to defend her actions, advised her to seek a plea agreement. The evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of false police reports, unauthorized surveillance photos, and documented discriminatory comments at HOA meetings. Sarah and Michael, meanwhile, returned from their honeymoon to find their neighborhood transformed. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance now stopped by with welcoming gifts and apologies for not speaking up sooner about Karen's behavior. 1 month after the wedding, Karen received notice that she was being sued by the city for the costs associated with responding to her false reports. The police department had calculated the expense of every unnecessary response to her calls, creating a substantial bill. The department has better things to do than respond to discriminatory false alarms, Commissioner Anderson stated during a press conference. We're sending a clear message that such behavior will not be tolerated. Karen's life became increasingly isolated. Her social circle, already small, vanished entirely when people learned of her actions. The local country club, where she had proudly held membership, quietly refused to renew it. Even her book club asked her to step away temporarily. The pressure reached its peak when her employer, a real estate firm, called her in for a meeting. They had received multiple complaints about her behavior, and concerns were raised about her ability to serve a diverse client base. Your actions reflect poorly on our company's values, her manager explained while placing her on indefinite administrative leave. 6 months into the legal proceedings, Karen's attorney finally convinced her to accept a plea deal. The agreement required her to pay substantial fines, attend mandatory diversity training, and issue formal apologies to Sarah, Michael, and the police department. The day she signed the plea agreement, Karen watched through her window as Sarah and Michael hosted a neighborhood barbecue. The gathering included people from various backgrounds: judges, doctors, police officers, and neighbors, all celebrating together peacefully. As summer turned to fall, for SALE signs appeared in front of Karen's house. The neighborhood buzzed with the news that she was moving away, forced by legal fees and social isolation to seek a fresh start elsewhere. To be continued in Part 8. 1 year after the wedding incident, Sarah and Michael's neighborhood had transformed into a model of community integration and acceptance. The empty house where Karen once lived had new owners, a young interracial family with 2 children who were warmly welcomed by everyone on the street. Sarah and Michael had turned their experience into something positive. Using their professional connections and personal story, they'd established the Bridge Building Community Initiative, a local organization dedicated to fighting discrimination and promoting neighborhood unity. What happened at our wedding could have left us bitter, Sarah explained during the initiative's first community meeting held in their backyard, the same place where their wedding drama had unfolded. Instead, we chose to create something meaningful from it. Michael, standing beside his wife, added, "Sometimes the worst situations bring out the best in a community. We've seen that firsthand." The initiative quickly gained support. Police Commissioner Anderson implemented new training programs for officers, using their wedding incident as a case study in handling false reports motivated by bias. Local real estate agencies, still stinging from their association with Karen, sponsored workshops on fair housing practices. News about Karen occasionally reached the neighborhood. She had moved to a small town 3 states away, where she lived quietly, chastened by her experience. The legal consequences of her actions had forced her to downsize significantly, and the story of her behavior had followed her despite her attempts to start fresh. Dr. Patricia Chen, who had become close friends with Sarah and Michael, often referenced their story in her medical school lectures about diversity in healthcare. "Prejudice can appear anywhere," she would tell her students, "but so can courage and change." The neighborhood itself had become more vibrant. Monthly community gatherings became a tradition, with residents sharing foods from different cultures and celebrating various holidays together. The HOA, once a platform for Karen's complaints, now focused on genuine community improvements and inclusion initiatives. One sunny afternoon, almost exactly a year after the wedding, Officer Martinez stopped by Sarah and Michael's house. He wasn't responding to a complaint this time but delivering good news. "The department has used your case to revise our protocols for handling potentially discriminatory complaints," he explained. "We've already seen a significant decrease in false reports across the city." Sarah and Michael's home had become a symbol of positive change. The garden where their wedding took place now hosted regular community events. The couple had added a small plaque near their gate that read, "All are welcome here, building bridges, not walls." The legal community had taken notice too. Sarah was invited to speak at judicial conferences about community relations and bias in the legal system. Her experiences helped shape new guidelines for handling harassment cases involving public officials. Michael's hospital implemented new policies to protect staff from discrimination, inspired by the support he had received during their wedding crisis. The medical community rallied around these changes, creating a more inclusive environment for both healthcare workers and patients. As for the wedding photos, they became something of a legend. The moment when Karen confronted a yard full of judges, doctors, and law enforcement officials was captured by their photographer. The image, while never publicly released out of professional courtesy, hung in Sarah's chambers as a reminder that justice sometimes arrives in unexpected ways. During their first anniversary celebration, surrounded by friends and neighbors in the same backyard, Sarah raised a toast. A year ago, someone tried to divide us. Instead, they brought us closer together. Sometimes the best response to hatred is to build something beautiful in its place. The neighborhood children now play freely in all the yards, no longer worried about complaints. The sound of their laughter had replaced the tension that once filled the air. New families moving in were greeted with welcome baskets and invitations to community events. The final piece of Karen's story arrived in the form of a letter, forwarded through her attorney. It contained a genuine apology, written after months of court-mandated counseling and reflection. While the community had moved forward without her, her words served as a reminder that change was possible, even if it came through difficult lessons. Sarah and Michael's experience had transformed their neighborhood into something more than just a collection of houses. It had become a true community, stronger and more united than ever before. Their wedding day drama, instead of breaking them, had built a foundation for lasting positive change. The end.